The morning the lake turned gold, Emily stood barefoot on the creaking wood floor, her hand resting on the windowsill of a house she once believed would save her. Outside, the mist floated lazily over the still water. The kind of morning people, posted on postcards, the kind of morning she had dreamed of for a decade. And today, she was handing it away. She placed the keys on the kitchen table. Her fingers lingered for just a second too long. It wasn't just a house. It was her sanctuary, her surrender, and eventually, her weapon. 10 years ago, she'd believed in fairy, tales wrapped in flannel shirts and Saturday morning pancakes. Back then, James had kissed her knuckles in grocery lines, had whispered about growing old together in a cabin by the water, and when they lost the baby, when her father's cancer returned, when life swallowed her whole, he was there. Or so she thought. They'd built this house, plank by plank, floorboards stained with laughter and late-night compromises. She chose the lake for its silence, but somehow, in the quiet, the whispers began, whispers that belonged to someone else. Emily glanced at the chimney smoke curling into the gray sky. Everything looked calm from the outside, but the most dangerous storms never shout. They wait, softly. She tightened her scarf, nodded once, and turned her back on the dream she had built. The door closed behind her with the gentlest of thuds, final, but freeing. Because sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is leave quietly, right after she's made sure you'll never forget her. Before we jump in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first time Emily saw the lake, it was nothing but a rough patch of land framed by pine trees and silence. James had stood behind her, arms wrapped around her waist, chin resting on her shoulder. "This is where it begins," he'd whispered. "Our forever." She had believed him. Back then, Emily was 35, worn thin from caregiving and heartbreak. She'd buried her father the same year she miscarried their only child. The city felt like it was closing in, too loud, too full of memories she couldn't escape. James had been her steady place. At least that's how she remembered it. They bought the land together. She sold her father's old truck to help with the down payment. James promised to handle the contractors, but Emily was the one who kept the ledger, negotiated the permits, chose the stone for the fireplace. She worked late nights at the marketing firm and spent weekends driving 2 hours just to see the foundation take shape. When the frame of the house went up, she cried. Not because of the house, but because, for the first time in a long time, something was growing instead of being taken away. They made love on the unfinished floorboards, under the stars, laughing like teenagers. She thought they were healing. She thought James was still hers. And for a while, everything looked perfect. But grief is a quiet ghost. It lingers in corners, slips between bodies at night. And sometimes it doesn't break you apart. It just makes the cracks deep enough for someone else to slip in. James had started taking more business trips. Emily didn't ask questions. She thought space was good. She thought trust meant not checking his phone. She thought love meant patience. Then came Sarah and Ethan. Sarah had arrived with a story full of chaos, an apartment flood, a temporary mold relocation, and a promise that it would only be for a couple of weeks. Ethan, her teenage son, barely looked up from his phone when they arrived. Emily, being Emily, had nodded, smiled, and opened the guest room. For the first few days, it felt like any other favor to an old friend. Sarah and Emily had once shared dorm rooms, heartbreaks, hangovers. They'd lost touch for a while, but James was the one who reconnected them after a reunion mixer downtown. Back then it had seemed sweet, nostalgic even. But now, the lines of familiarity began to blur. Sarah moved through Emily's kitchen like she'd built it. She rearranged the spice rack. She took over breakfast duty. She bought matching mugs, 2, not 3, and left them out every morning. She laughed loudly at James's jokes, the ones Emily had heard too many times to find charming. And James, he softened around Sarah in a way Emily hadn't seen in years. He smiled more. He shaved more often. He wore cologne again. When Emily brought it up hesitantly, James waved it off with a chuckle. "Don't be silly, Em. You're imagining things." She wasn't. Every evening, Sarah lingered a little longer in the kitchen. James stayed up late, saying he had emails to answer. One night, Emily woke up alone and found him downstairs, on the couch, whispering into his phone. When she appeared, in the doorway, he looked up, startled. "Can't sleep," he'd muttered, not meeting her eyes, just catching up on work. The next morning, the air between them was paper-thin, tense, fragile. The house by the lake had become crowded in, all the wrong ways, not because of furniture or noise, but because Sarah's perfume lingered in the hallways, and James's gaze no longer stayed with Emily for more than a moment. And for the first time since they'd built it, the house didn't feel like hers anymore. Emily had always been the kind of woman who noticed the small things. How the coffee tasted slightly different. How the towels smelled like a different brand of detergent. How James's side of the bed remained cold longer in the mornings. But it was the photo that broke her. She hadn't been snooping. At least, that's what she told herself. She'd simply needed to print a recipe and used James's laptop, which was open on the dining room table. One accidental swipe of the trackpad, and the screen lit up to reveal a message thread. Sarah's name glowing at the top. The last photo James had sent was of Emily, asleep, her mouth slightly open, face slack with exhaustion, still in her robe. Below it, a message from him. "Sleeping Beauty, if she ate all 7 dwarfs." Sarah had replied with a string of laughing emojis, then, "Whale sighting by the lake. Should we call the Coast Guard?" Emily's heart dropped into her stomach. It wasn't just betrayal. It was mockery, cruelty. It was realizing that the man she had grieved with, built with, trusted with her body, and her grief, and her years, was now sending pictures of her sleeping to another woman for sport. She didn't cry. Not then. She simply closed the laptop, stood in her quiet kitchen, and stared out at the lake through the wide picture window. It shimmered like glass, still and perfect. A mirror. But what she saw staring back at her wasn't her reflection. It was the realization. You were never the one. You were just the placeholder until she came back. Her phone vibrated, a message from James. "Running late. Sarah's cooking tonight. Don't. Wait up." Emily turned the phone over, walked into the living room, sat on the couch in the center of the home she had dreamed of and built from the ashes of her past. And for the first time in 10 years, she allowed herself to picture leaving it all behind, or burning it down in a way they would never see coming. The next morning, Emily woke before dawn. The lake outside was covered in a thin layer of mist, like a secret the world hadn't yet decided to share. She sipped her coffee slowly, her fingers wrapped tightly around the chipped ceramic mug James had once said looked too handmade for his taste. She looked around the kitchen. Every drawer, every tile, every spoon had a story. Stories she'd written, mostly alone. By 9 a.m., she had called her mother. "Mom," she said, her voice steady. "I need you to listen without interrupting, and I need you not to cry." There was a pause, then a soft, "Go on, baby." Emily told her everything, not just about the texts or the sleeping photo or the cruel jokes. She told her about the loneliness, the slow erasure of her self-worth, the weight of always being the one who held everything together. And then she said the words she never thought she'd say. "I want to sell the house." Silence. Then, after a breath, her mother replied, "Do it, and make it count." Emily hung up and made her next call, to Paul and Grace Robinson, a retired couple who had left a note on her mailbox a month earlier, asking if she'd ever consider selling the property. She'd saved the note. At the time, she laughed it off. Now it felt like fate tapping her on the shoulder. "Is the offer still open?" she asked. Paul sounded delighted. "Absolutely. We'd still love to come by again if you're ready." "I am," Emily said. "But there's a condition. I need you to close by next Friday, and I need you to keep quiet about it, especially if anyone shows up asking questions." Grace chuckled gently. "You're planning something, aren't you?" Emily smiled for the first time in weeks. "You could say that." That afternoon, James came home later than usual, smelling faintly of Sarah's perfume. He kissed Emily's cheek absent-mindedly and mumbled something about a trip he and Sarah were planning. Just for a week, he said, to get away before the full move. Emily just nodded, eyes calm. "Sounds wonderful," she said. And that night, while James lay snoring on the other side of the bed, Emily was downstairs with a real estate attorney, finalizing paperwork. The house was nearly gone, and so was the woman James thought he had. Broken. He didn't know it yet, but Emily was about to show him that, when a woman rebuilds herself in silence, the sound of her revenge echo loudest. The closing happened on a Thursday. Quietly, without ceremony. Emily had packed what she needed days before. Her camera gear, a few favorite books, her grandmother's quilt. The rest, she left behind like a shedding skin. Paul and Grace arrived mid-afternoon with soft voices and kind eyes, carrying a bottle of wine as a housewarming gift. For themselves. Emily handed over the keys with no emotion, no second thoughts. As she pulled away from the gravel drive, she didn't look in the rearview mirror. The house, her house, was no longer hers. It had become something else, a symbol of a dream that turned into a cage. And now it would be someone else's sanctuary. She had no desire to haunt it. The next morning, James called in a frenzy. "Emily, the key doesn't work. Why won't it open?" Emily held the phone an inch away from her ear, listening to the confusion and rising panic in his voice. "Because it's not your house anymore," she said calmly. "I sold it." A long silence. "What? You what?" "I sold it, James. To the Robinsons. Remember them? They stopped by once. You said they looked like they couldn't afford a house like ours." He sputtered. "But Sarah and Ethan, we're moving in tomorrow. Our things are packed." Emily smiled faintly. "You might want to unpack?" His voice was shrill now. "You can't just... You didn't even tell me." "Oh, I didn't think I needed to," she said. "After all, you and Sarah made plenty of decisions without consulting me." Another silence. Then, in a lower voice, bitter and cold, he said, "You think this is revenge?" Emily's answer was soft, measured. "No, this is clarity. You mistook my kindness for weakness. And now, you're just going to have to live with the consequences." She hung up. Her hands didn't shake. Later that day, she turned off her phone, booked herself a weekend at a small seaside inn, and sat by the window of her room with a view of the ocean. A new body of water, a new beginning. And for the first time in years, the silence around her didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like peace. 6 months later, Emily didn't recognize the woman in the mirror, and that was a good thing. Her hair had grown longer, streaked with soft honey tones from the sun. Her skin looked healthier, her eyes clearer. She'd lost some weight, sure, but more importantly, she'd lost the heaviness in her spirit. The kind that doesn't show up on a scale but wears down your soul. She wasn't living in a mansion now, just a modest craftsman cottage near a row of galleries and coffee shops. The kitchen had chipped tiles. The floor creaked near the back door, and she loved it like an old song you rediscover one rainy afternoon. Most days she walked to her favorite cafe, camera slung over her shoulder, sipping coffee from a mismatched mug while she edited photos of sunrises, rusted boats, and old fishermen's hands. The town knew her by name now, not as James's wife or the woman from the lake house, but as Emily, the photographer who captured the quiet kind of strength. One crisp October afternoon, while framing a shot of seagulls in flight, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Need a better angle, try squatting lower. Otherwise you'll catch too much glare off the water." She turned. Kevin, the quiet man who ran the framing shop. Witty, a little awkward, and always wore threadbare flannel shirts that somehow looked expensive on him. She smiled. "You trying to steal my job?" "No," he said, then shrugged. "Maybe just your attention." They started meeting every Friday for coffee. At first, it was casual. Then it wasn't. Kevin didn't rush, didn't push. He asked questions. He listened. And when Emily told him everything, not just the polished version, but the raw, aching middle, he didn't flinch. He nodded. He stayed. One night, over dinner at a cozy bistro lit with candles and old jazz records, he reached for her hand. "I don't want to fix you, Emily," he said. "I just want to know you." She didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. She just squeezed his hand back and smiled, tears stinging the corners of her eyes, because for the first time in years, she didn't feel like someone's disappointment. She felt chosen, not for what she could offer, not for what she could sacrifice, but for who she was when no one else was looking. It was a warm Sunday morning when Emily returned to the lake house. Not as a resident, but as a guest. Paul and Grace had invited her and Kevin for brunch, insisting it was time they all met, properly. The lake shimmered as always, as if nothing had ever happened. But Emily was no longer the same woman who once stood on that porch, heart in shambles, holding on to the ruins of a dream. As they pulled into the gravel driveway, Kevin glanced at her. "You okay?" Emily smiled. "I'm more than okay." Paul greeted them with a hug, his wide-brimmed hat crooked as ever. Grace, elegant and kind as always, ushered them in with cinnamon rolls and strong coffee. The house had changed. New furniture, brighter paint. Even the scent was different. Less floral, more cedar and spice. But the bones of it, the memories embedded in its walls, still whispered to her. "Still feels like home?" Grace asked gently, setting a plate in front of her. Emily looked around. "No, but that's the beautiful part. I don't need it to be." After brunch, they walked down the dock. Kevin held her hand as they watched the water ripple in the breeze. Paul and Grace trailed behind, talking about tomatoes and roof repairs. Emily glanced at Kevin, his flannel sleeves rolled up, sun catching in his hair. "You know what the hardest part of all this was?" He looked at her. "What?" Letting go of the version of me who thought she had to fight for love that didn't love her back, Kevin didn't say anything. He just brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. Back at the house, Grace handed Emily a small box. "We found this in a drawer. Thought it might belong to you." Inside was a keychain. Brass, slightly tarnished. The one Emily had custom-ordered when she and James first bought the place. On it, engraved in delicate script, were the words, "Home is where you feel safe to be yourself." She closed her fingers around it, then slipped it into her coat pocket. As they drove away, Emily didn't look back. Some homes you build with walls and roofs. Others you build with people and trust. And this time she was building something that couldn't be taken from her. 3 months later, the lake house was just a memory Emily carried like a stone in her pocket. Not heavy with pain anymore, but smooth and quiet, softened by time. Her life had shifted into something simpler, freer. Mornings started with her sketching beside a window that faced east, where the sun kissed the trees outside her new townhome. She was teaching part-time again, art classes for women over 40, who'd once been told they weren't creative enough. They painted wild things, oceans with no horizons, women with fire in their eyes, birds with broken wings still mid-flight. One evening, after class, Kevin showed up with Thai food and a bottle of wine. He didn't knock anymore. He just waited outside until she opened the door with that smile that said, "You're always welcome, but I'm not waiting on anyone anymore." They sat on the floor, backs against the couch, laughing over curry and memories. Somewhere between the second glass of wine and the last bite of mango sticky rice, Kevin reached into his coat and pulled out a small velvet box. Emily froze. "Don't panic," he said, laughing at her widened eyes. "It's not what you think." Inside was a silver pendant, delicate. On one side, a tiny etching of a pine tree. On the other, just one word, "Stay." Kevin looked at her. "Not forever, not even every day. Just stay when it feels right." Emily blinked back tears and nodded. There was no grand proposal, no promises inked in gold. Just two people choosing each other again and again in the quiet moments of real life. Later that night, as she washed her face and brushed her hair, Emily caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror. The lines near her eyes didn't disappear, but for the first time in years, she saw a woman who had stopped trying to be small enough to be loved and had become big enough to love herself entirely. She turned out the light and went to bed with the window open, the cool air drifting in. And somewhere in the distance, the lake carried her laughter on the wind. 3 weeks after Kevin gave her the pendant, Emily stood on the porch of a modest gallery nestled in the historic district of town. It had white brick walls, ivy crawling up the side, and a sign above the door that simply read, "Crescendo." Inside, under soft amber lights and the scent of jasmine tea, her first solo photography exhibit was opening, titled Unseen Rooms. The collection captured forgotten corners of old homes, shadowed hallways, unmade beds, coffee mugs left beside rain-streaked windows. Each image whispered of lives paused mid-sentence, of presence, of absence, of reclaiming space. She hadn't expected many people to show up, but they came. Women in linen dresses and wide smiles, college students with journals tucked under their arms. Even Paul and Grace drove in from the lake to surprise her, bringing flowers and cookies in a paper bag. Emily stood near the back wall, watching from behind a glass of sparkling water. Kevin hovered nearby but gave her space. Always space. A woman in her 60s walked up to a photo of a single chair facing a broken window and said, "This one. This feels like my first divorce. Not the pain, but the silence after. The kind that's full of possibilities." Emily smiled softly and nodded. That's exactly it. Later, after the guests had gone and the gallery had gone quiet, Kevin reached for her hand. "People saw you tonight," he said gently. "Not just your work. You." Emily looked around the room. It no longer felt too big or too white or too exposed. It felt like hers. The gallery owner approached. "We had nearly 80 people tonight." She beamed. "And 3 pieces already sold. Would you consider doing a talk next month? Something about starting over?" Emily didn't hesitate this time. "Yes," she said. "I'd love to." Outside, the moon rose over the old cobblestone streets, casting soft silver on the sidewalk. Emily stepped out, hand in Kevin's, pendant warm against her chest. For the first time in her life, she wasn't walking away from anything. She was walking toward everything, and that was how Emily reclaimed not just her home, but herself. What they thought would break her became the very thing that built her. What they tried to steal, she turned into strength. And the house by the lake? It was never about the walls or the view. It was always about finding a place where she was no longer invisible, where she could finally, unapologetically belong. If you've ever been made to feel small in a space you helped build, or silenced in a story that should have been yours to tell, know this: you're not alone. And your voice? It's more powerful than you think. Before you go, let me ask, have you ever had to walk away from something beautiful to find something real? Leave a comment and let me know. And if this story touched you in any way, please take a second to subscribe. Tomorrow I have something waiting for you. Something I promise will stay with you long after the last word. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next story.